to go and witness only 2 polling stations, but we thought it was worth it doing so because it gave us an understanding of a remote polling station. So we tried as much as possible to cover the diversity of polling stations in the Republic of Somaliland. Based on the reports that we received and our internal discussions, we concluded that the election was peaceful, it was fair, and it is credible. Peaceful. There were incidents, but in our opinion, they were not sufficient to derail the will of the Somaliland people. On that basis, we are happy to share with you this message. As we leave Hargeisa, if we leave Somaliland today, we wish the people of Somaliland well in their next phase of a new government that they would have elected. Many of us in the team, at first we thought, yeah, okay, Somalia, Somaliland, same thing. That excludes Craig and Diana, those are locals here, and Matthew, and they understood the uniqueness of Somaliland and the rich history of Somaliland. But we were quick to learn. My first learning opportunity occurred at the airport when I was conversing with a former Minister of Foreign Affairs. She looked at me and she said, "I know you." And I thought, yeah, I've been into so many places, you could know me. And we started a conversation, and I made a mistake and said Somalia, and that ended the conversation. She corrected me very, very sharply. This is Somaliland, not Somalia. And that, the rich history of Somaliland, the aspirations that we see of the people of Somaliland have been touching to all of us. And in line with our long-held beliefs that people should chart their own destiny and futures, we wish the Republic of Somaliland well in its endeavors as it charts its way into the future. I thank you. I'll stop here with these a few remarks and invite my colleague to come and take it forward.
Thank you very much, my team leader, and also Greg. Good morning, Your Excellencies, and also various dignitaries in the room, and also members of the Fourth Estate. Since our team leader has spoken, and by the way, I recognize quite a few faces in the room, chief among them, my dear brother for many years and all this. And so I feel very much at home. Let me go straight to really, thank the people of Somaliland for a very, my leaders say, very successful elections of what we witnessed 2 days ago. And proceed then to say that the biggest asset of Somaliland apart from the resilient people, is your democracy, which is very well known in the region. And continue to plead that please guard this cherishly, this important asset, because it's what Greg calls, in a sea of troubled waters, we have a beacon of hope in Somaliland. And please continue to be that beacon of hope. Elections are never perfect. And the reason why observers come is not to come and ensure that that election goes well, is to observe what has gone on, and from that observation, indicate whether the elections as held during the time have been fair and free, which we have already concluded, but also make recommendations for future improvement. For us, having been here just this week, it may not be fair for us then to be here and pontificate on the entire election process, because the election cycle is long. It starts from registration of voters, the campaign process, the resources that are made available for the management board, and then, of course, how electioneering is conducted, whether it is in an atmosphere that enables the various political parties to present their views to the people in order for the people to make a choice. And then, of course, the election day, which is largely what our observation is made of, and then what has gone on. And, of course, the day after. It is heartening to see. And, of course, the reports that we received, having met some of the political parties before the election day, to see nobody was complaining about the capacity of NEC to manage these elections. And indeed, we witnessed it. Of course, there were a few challenges, and those are some of the things that we, so that you can improve for the future. And so some of the recommendations which Gray will be presenting will go around the technology issues, support by international community, because this is one of the challenges Somalia has had, and also to be able to have robust registration that can mitigate against interference in the elections, of whatever nature, to ensure there is an atmosphere that the people make a choice for themselves without undue influence. But also some recommendations on how you can also improve, particularly in the areas of after you have counted, how you could transmit this to the people. But overall, and so far, we are really encouraged to see the calmness, the enthusiasm. Being at the polling station was self-evident to see those people coming, some challenged physically, but wanting to make their voice heard. And to us, that's why we say, please guard this jealously. And therefore, it's now my honor again to ask Greg to summarize for us that report that he indicated. Thank you so much.
Hello again. Thank you very much, Mokgetsi and Erastus. What I'm going to do is run through our brief findings, and then there'll be an opportunity to take questions. The middle? Left click. This is a presentation in 5 very brief parts. An overview of the mission, the pre-election engagements, a summary of election day activities, our observations, and then critically, some recommendations for the future. I don't think it's very helpful for any election observation mission not to try and draw some conclusions to make the next process even better than the last one. I've already been through the observation mission. There's 20 of us. As the mission head said, we divided into 4 different areas: Baroma, Berbera, Berau, and Hargeisa. There were more in Hargeisa, of course. The teams of 4, which were further divided into teams of 2, went out to the other 3 centres, and the remainder stayed behind in Berbera. We met at the start with the National Election Commission after some initial briefings with experts in the area, including our in-house experts. We went to the briefing, as many of you did, in the other election monitoring teams, and then there were a whole bunch of questions, so we engaged further. And I have to commend the NEC Commissioner, or Chairman, who made time, and what must have been an unbelievably compressed schedule, to come and see us to answer the specific questions that we had. We also met with key political parties. 1 or 2 of them will recognize themselves here. The President, the USID Party, and of course Wadani. And as I said, we divided into these 4 teams, averaging 64 polling stations per 2-man or 2-person team. And the idea was we started off at 1 polling station before 7 o'clock in the morning, and then we went back there before closing to the same station and observed the counting process at that particular station. In total, there were 635 polling stations observed. We were busy, which is nearly 1/4 of all the polling stations across the country. And if you took the maximum but possible number of voters, it's over 300,000 voters. Of course, we don't know what the final number was of turnout, but I would suspect it's somewhere around about between 60 and 70% based on our own samples. We also tried during the course of the day to get a sense of how voting was going. So if you look at each polling station, at the registration documents, you'll get the total number registered on the registration books, and we were able then, every time we visited, to be able to get a sense of how many people had voted because of the number of books that had been employed. And if I remember correctly, there were 50 sheets per book, and we were able to make a guesstimate calculation as to the turnout at that particular point over the course of the day. The key observations were that voting was peaceful, and that polling stations were well managed by the staff, and they were mostly university-age women, as we've already said. They opened on time with very few exceptions. There was some delay. 1 case in Berau, a book hadn't pitched up until 9 o'clock, for instance. But we didn't see anybody who was turned away. As a consequence of that, people waited out until there were any problems that had been resolved. And the presence of large numbers of women was very notable. I don't know whether there'll be those statistics released by the National Election Commission, but I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of voters were women, which says something particular about Somaliland's democracy in this respect. The voting procedures were adhered to with voter identification, the allocation of ballot papers and so on, and the voting in secret, with a few exceptions, and I'll come to that in a moment, and the use of indelible ink to mark voters. Where people couldn't vote or didn't understand what was required, that process was handled transparently. They announced who they were going to vote for. Of course, it didn't become secret then. And the party agent or the electoral official helped them at their request to put the cross in the right place, but this was in very much a minority of cases, and all of the election agents pronounced themselves happy with that process in every instance. The IRIS system was operational in the vast majority of the polling stations that we visited. As you know, there was a backup anyway in terms of the manual registration process, and in every case both processes were used side by side. The IRIS system made the manual process much quicker. We have some recommendations about how to improve this, which I'll come to in a moment. But it operated, it was patchy. In Beral, for instance, it was less than 10% of the 145 polling stations that we visited, or the computer had failed, or they didn't talk to each other, whatever the question was. In other areas, that percentage was slightly less, but generally, I think in Berbera and Baroma, it was much the same. A few voters appeared to be younger than the minimum age of 15. I was a very young 15. I'm a very young 60, actually. But they appeared, on questioning, to have the proper identification, although they looked pretty young for 15. And one has to, I think, have a slight scrutiny of the voters' role in the registration process in those instances. Some were placeholders in the queues for their parents or for others. That much was admitted. Voting was predominantly in the morning. There were big crowds in the morning in one or two places. I'll come back to this. There was a polling center, and there were more than one polling station inside. And by establishing a perimeter and by not managing outside the perimeter, there tended to be a big crush of people. This was noted in Hargeisa. It was noted also particularly in Beral, at the first polling center station that we went to. And there was a huge crush of women outside. Use of the whip, or I don't know what they call it in Somaliland, a sort of stick, push people back. That's quite easy to remedy with better crowd control outside the perimeter. And then it was very quickly worked out that the way to do this was to actually divide people into lines outside and then allow them to filter in, and order was re-established. The closure of polling stations, in some cases, the counting started fairly quickly. People were tired. The polling officials were tired. The party agents were tired. But the polling was conducted openly, transparently. The counting was conducted openly and transparently, and with the party agents in agreement. I don't believe we saw a single instance of disagreements about results. There was some discussion and debate about where the X was made, whether there was smudging or not, but generally speaking, this process was handled very efficiently with the agreement of the party agents. Unused voting materials and other voting materials were correctly accounted for. I actually checked on this, where I asked the one polling center or station for unused ballot papers, because I wanted to keep them as a souvenir, and then they said, no, you can't do that because we have to account for them. It was very, very clearly adhered to in that regard. As I mentioned, we saw two notable security incidences, but the voting did continue, and they settled down at those two stations. The recommendations, the nub of this presentation. We would say that the independence and functions of the National Electoral Commission should be not only maintained, but should be strengthened. And as the head of our mission and as Mr. Mwensha have both said, Somaliland needs to be congratulated, and the NEC needs to be congratulated in particular for handling and running an election in a very poor country of a 650 GDP per capita economy. A lot of African countries will say that democracy is an expense that they can ill afford. I would argue that it's a cost, it's an expense that you can't not afford. You absolutely have to afford this, and Somaliland shows what's possible, even with a small budget and a relatively poor environment. And the NEC needs to be congratulated, as do the Somalilanders themselves, in the way in which this election was conducted, for the most part in good humor. There is a fundamental need to treat local and international observers the same, to treat them equally. There was some concern right at the outset that insiders were not going to be allowed to observe the counting process. That was soon clarified to in fact be the case. They were allowed to view the counting process, as indeed we were allowed to view the counting process. But these sorts of things, any sorts of confusion, should be clarified from the outset, and observers should be treated fairly and equally. We would stress the need for donor funding for local monitors in particular. We think it's exceptionally regrettable that some foreign donors withdrew support for the backbone of local observation efforts, and in so doing, wittingly or not, played into regional politicking. This is a Somaliland election. Regional politics should be put aside in that election process. Both Mr. Mwensha and Prime Minister Majoro have indicated Somaliland is an island of stability in a sea of great instability at the moment, and its election process and its democracy should be consolidated and indeed strengthened, and the donors have a meaningful role to play in this respect. They can also undermine it because of their playing differently. A thorough check on voter registration should be a matter of course, and particularly of the role and the need to eliminate I'm a little suspicious of. There needs to be a clear ban on party political politicking on election day. I know that lots of cameras are present when President Trump voted or anybody else votes in any election. That goes with the but actually turning this into a grandstanding event is something different. And I think the political parties need to, in their own enthusiasm at times, in the interests of democracy. I would argue for, and we would argue for, improved geolocation of polling centres, particularly as young people move increasingly to these devices running their lives, appear to do for my children, and improved signposting will help for people like myself who don't have these things run their lives. And I think greater of voters with disabilities. We saw several instances of people in wheelchairs struggling their way to make their mark, and perhaps better identification at the outset. And I know the conditions in these polling stations is not easy, but great identification at the outset of those facilities with better. We think that the iris system should be extended countrywide. It was a great asset. It helps to clear up any confusion. Well, I've observed elections in other places, in Kenya, for instance, and certainly the iris system here was as good as any that I've seen. And again, the way in which it was utilized, the reliable and the laptop requires a long-term power system. And if there's no power available, then you need to use batteries, and those need to be made available. He made a comment about in the way in which this should be perhaps better organized and extended, avoiding the crushes at the entrances to polling centers. results at the various polling centres. And that enables parallel voter tabulation to occur, which helps in the process of transparency and helps to monitor that it's incumbent on the political parties to disclose their political funding bases. It's the norm in Africa, as you've probably seen, but it has become a matter of law and a matter of course captured by particularly narrow external or internal economic or political interests. And out there. And the best way of dealing with that is to be transparent. You risk undermining your democracy if you don't apply that. That probably means NEC or government agencies or enforcing at least a spirit of collaboration by the political party that wins and has this allegation lingering over you as a consequence. And then finally, greater effort, identity-based, clan-based, if I can term it that. If I'm South African, racially based or ethnically based politics, to issue-based politics. And manifestos of each of the parties. As Somaliland's democracy and its voting public matures, this are made. And political parties should recognize that and play to that great strength. Let me conclude by saying this list is not exhaustive, of course. Top issues that we thought should be highlighted and that things that could be most easily attended to by scrutinized by the voting public, by the electorate in Somaliland. And let me just say finally that it's a great pleasure and an honor to be witness. Democracy is expensive, but it's a cost that's absolutely necessary, because it's only when you don't have it and it's not easy to create. It's not just a click of your fingers and you create a democratic process, institutions, but also a public that responds in the way that's intended. That takes many years to cultivate, many years to as I say again, island of stability in what resembles increasingly a sea of concern, let's say, kindly, in this room. By saying congratulations to Somalilanders, congratulations on the way in which this election was run. It's a credit to yourselves, and it's a credit to Africa. Thank you very much. There's some to members of our delegation, so they shouldn't be sleeping or dozing. If you have any questions, please ask them. Well, it provides a benchmark, but not just for Somaliland, but also for others. You know, I'm a political scientist by training, and there's a body of opinion out there that says, particularly in Asia, you have to have your GDP per capita to afford democracy. And actually, Somaliland completely runs against that theory. The absence of democracy is you have managed your politics over the last 30 years. So I think that Somaliland is not only an example to other African countries, it's an example further afield. And in an era where politics is increasingly, and it's driven in part by social media, becoming a competition for populist slogans and empty promises, I think it's very important for Somaliland also to lead the way in being rooted in the reality of political promises and political activities. So there's almost two sides to this. One's the technical aspect of running an election, the logistics and so on, and the other is the spirit, the way in which elections are run, the way in which people engage with these issues. So I do believe that Somaliland breaks that idea, that shatters the idea that you have to be rich to enjoy the fruits of democracy. In fact, I think you have to be, it's absolutely essential for growth and stability to have democracy. And I think it's and this is a personal comment, not one by this mission, but it's so important for donors to calibrate assistance to those countries, those donors who regard democracy as an asset, to calibrate their assistance to those that are going about operating according to democratic norms and standards as Somaliland is. And one would hope that out of this election comes further assistance so that you can build on the sorts of progress that you've made over the last 20 years. Sure.
First of all, thanks for your great findings you made in international service. On behalf of Somaliland people, we have noted the 11 recommendations that are implemented to improve the Somaliland election process. You know, what we do in this is to get international recognition from the law. While we do in the election is selling that Somaliland is a more democratic country in Horn Africa. Just to know, there's a debate between Somaliland and Somalia. We take time our independence from Somalia from 1991. So we need a larger expectancy from the international community. We need to be part of the UN agenda. So, as your observation, as you see the status of Somaliland, how people vote, how people cast their vote, how people more doing their exercise of interest, how your international observers will contribute to self and show overall the deliberate momentum that Somaliland takes to them in taking over.
If I take a question out of that, I would say that, I mean, having international observers here is part of that process of advertising your strengths and successes. And the fact that we've been so warmly embraced and our role has been facilitated across such a wide geography in not the easiest operating conditions for anybody, I think is a credit to that, to Somaliland and evidence of those conditions. Most interestingly, it's the one thing I think that all Somalilanders, or certainly all the political parties that we spoke to, seem to agree on, which is Somaliland wants international recognition. The process of acquiring that international recognition has ebbed and flowed, let's say, in terms of its perhaps prioritization over the last 30 years. And it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 5 years, how the government goes about accelerating that process. But your greatest asset, I would argue, in this quest for recognition, which is tied to your security, your management of your own affairs, your levels of governance, is the way in which you exhibit the way in which you display your democracy to the world at these events. And it's in stark contrast to what's happening in the rest of the region, where there are very limited democracies at best in most countries. Not all. I'm mindful of my Kenyan colleagues here, but in most countries. And there's a tendency in parts of Africa of democratic recession, of regression, that democracy is fading away, that people prefer an authoritarian type outcome or way in which you run your government system. And Somaliland is a countervailing, it's a contradictory example of the benefits of democracy. And that's so important, not just to Somaliland, not just to your independence ambitions, but to others in Africa. That you've invested in that, you've doubled down on democracy. And that's perhaps the big takeaway out of this, is Somaliland's doubled down on democracy and deserves to be supported. Well, I'm going to actually ask one of my colleagues to respond on this. But from what we observed in the Baral region, and we were doing these calculations as I measured because there was no other means of assessing this, that there was reasonable turnout, faded away in the afternoon, but we would anticipate roughly, from our rough calculations, guesstimate, around about a 60%, two-thirds turnout. But that's very unscientific. That's just simply an anecdotal observation rather than a scientific one. In what we observed, and that's mindful of that caveat, we didn't see in Baral anybody being turned away at the polling stations that we observed, 145 at various times over the course of the day. Now, of course, an election observation mission is by its very nature limited. Unlike SONSAF, who spent whole days with one person at one mission, and that's absolutely critical, it's a very important role, you're not monitoring a single polling station over the whole day. So that's obviously a caveat in this regard. But we didn't see problems with registration. There were in Baral, but there were other instances. Perhaps Tendai, you might like to respond to this. Maybe come up here.
Yeah, thank you. The way I was in Boroma, the four of us, and there were few instances, particularly at the polling stations in the urban areas, where people got lost and went to the wrong polling station. So the secretary and the presiding officers had to direct them to the correct polling stations. But there was one polling station in Boroma where there were 3 women, registration card, which was for that particular center, but their names were not in the actual voters' roll. Their pictures were not in the actual voters' roll. So we tried them that we're just election observers. We had no powers, but we directed them to the commission. So we witnessed that in Boroma. So yes, there were a few people turned away, but only because polling stations. Thank you.
Sorry, are there any more questions over here? You mean you're concerned about privacy and about how this might be used to, whether every time we go through a passport control we can be scanned and our fingerprints taken and so on. I mean, I guess these things are a balance, personal rights. But I guess that's a question for Somalilanders, much more so than others. And I think you've seen the opposite to people in the voting public. Sometimes they have more dead people than they have living people. So, you know, I think the way in which was impressive and notable. Of course, it can be improved upon. And we mentioned the possibility of underage voting. You know, when you're an election observer, you're asking yourself a critical question, which is there anything that's happened out there that you can observe, that you have observed, that threatens the integrity of the result of this election or the process around this election? And our answer as this group is no. This election, nothing happened that threatened the integrity of this election. And in fact, a lot of things occurred which strengthened the outcome. Of course, nothing is perfect. Practice helps. And certainly Somaliland is evidence of how that practice has improved the process continuously. But perhaps there's somebody else. Kate, maybe? Would you like to comment on this? No, you don't? You happy? Karen? Yeah. It was about the infringement and retention of personal data. Edwin, you used biometric scanners in the Kenyan election. How would you say that Somaliland stacks up in this regard?
I guess we use biometric voter identification, but it is largely thumbprints. And we see a lot of challenges there, especially people who work on farms, people who work in construction. And sometimes identification kits don't work most of the time. But the Alice scanner was a nice surprise because from the polling stations that I attended myself in Baba region, out of the, say, 30 plus polling stations that we visited, I only saw failure. In fact, it wasn't the VDR itself that failed. It was the lack of computer. So I guess it looks a bit dramatic when they give you that scanner. It's like a looking book and documents. Most of the time it works, and I think it's a fantastic technology. And the time it took to identify a voter was quite efficient as well. So I think it is something to look into in terms of improving our own election.
And Kenya had a facial recognition system in parts. Right. Yeah. So again, something can be improved on, but again, overall, big question was, is there anything out there that would seemingly threaten the result of this election? Of course, one more question over there. I will make this the last one. And one here. A remark, short remark. Be careful of a former politician with a microphone.
Thanks, Mr. Intelligence and Press Information. I'm Samantha from the Somali National Television. Press Information has been witnessing Somali elections for more than 2 years. Compared with the last elections of Somali for combined president what improvements would you say Somali has made? I mean, what's the difference? What difference Somali has made at the elections, with the election system, the management, and all. What improvements?
That's a great question. I think the improvements were notably in the iris system, the way in which the iris system operated, and the training, I think, of generally of the election officials was obviously to a high standard. I don't know whether it was a higher standard, but it was done in a very professional, unthreatening manner from our vantage. And I think the other big improvement was over the conditions in which voting took place, which can be, they're classrooms. So sometimes classrooms are poor, sometimes they're poorer, sometimes they're better. Generally speaking, the standard was, at least from what I saw, higher than in 2021 of the facilities themselves, and also lighting and the relative efficiency of the counting process was much better. So I think those comments from 2021 had been taken on board, that the government should improve and the NEC should improve the lighting conditions. Because there were parts in the 2021 election where there was counting done with cell phone batteries, and the lighting was exceptionally dismal. So that was a big and noticeable improvement, and the speed at which counting was made is also part of that process. In terms of the overall attitude and the environment, I think it was, this seems to have fallen over. I think it was very similar. There's an incredible embracing of democracy in Somaliland. Thing that people cherish, apparently, and they engage in very enthusiastically. And in fact, in some cases, the problems at the polling station, people really wanted to get to make their mark and make their choice.
Since the questions has been resolved, delighted to be here, to have met and run into old friends such as the former chairperson of us.
Young friends.
Old friends, old friends, as well as 93 years of life, without finance. At any rate, Greg, we are very, very happy to have that. With Brent Hess, you were with us throughout this process during your days at the South African Institute of International Relations, way back. If some of you do not know, Greg and his team, in those days, Jeff Helps, a friend of Greg, yours, and a good friend of Somalia. You have been with us for time here, over the years. You have been following when I was in government, when I was not in government. Now I can speak on behalf of the government and the nation. We thank you immensely. Like always, it's a process of putting Somaliland and making a big focus with regards to what's particularly at this current situation in the regional geopolitical situation, as well as the international relations. We are at very, very critical time. I think you have seen it, you saw what you saw, and I think it's enough for us to say. There are those who do not thank people, who do not thank God. Thank you very much indeed, and I can say on behalf of Somaliland, please spread the good words and disregard whatever you have said. I ran into Obasanjo last time at the AU Summit, and he's a great friend. I just came back from West, the time that you gave us. Thank you very much indeed. And I think we should give those of us. Oh.
In Somaliland's arsenal